Unions are a fundamental part of the capitalist world. What do I mean by that? You see, we are living in a world, the capitalist world, which is in the middle of contradiction between capitalism and democracy. That's a fundamental contradiction. And it's a contradiction that has been there since the development of capitalism 300-400 years ago. In India, about 200 years ago. When capitalism comes into the world, it emerges at the same time as that other tremendous upsurge of people, which goes by the name of democracy, freedom, liberty, sovereignty. There are many names for this feeling that people have. As I said, democracy, sovereignty, liberty, and so on, many different names. But these names all capture the same feeling that people want to be free in some way. And freedom just doesn't mean the freedom to go anywhere or say anything. It means freedom to have their children grow up in a world where they have education, freedom for children to grow up in a world where they have health care, freedom for children to have leisure, and not just children. Why do we always say children? Freedom for all people to have education, dignity, the ability to have leisure, spend time with their friends, their families, their community, the time to be with each other, and not just the time to struggle to survive. You see, that feeling of democracy, freedom, liberty, whatever you call it, that feeling emerges alongside capitalism. Because capitalism, even though it is a tremendous social force, produces a lot of social wealth. Because capitalism doesn't provide people with the ability to realize their freedom, to live in a world where they feel dignified, where there is sovereignty, joy, freedom, liberty, equality, and so on. Capitalism smothers, suffocates that feeling that people have felt for hundreds of years. Why does capitalism suffocate that feeling? Well, it's quite simple, really. And I know the economics profession has provided for us books and manuals of great complexity. Among them, the most important being the work of Karl Marx, who identified the key aspect in capitalism that suffocates that feeling that humans have. And what is that key aspect in capitalism that does two things? That key aspect in capitalism is the idea and the practice of private property. You see, capitalism is founded on the idea of private property and profit for that private property. Those who control property feel entitled, feel that they have the right to extract profit from the world. And that desire to extract more and more profit, greater and greater amounts of profit, that desire to extract profit, both increases the social wealth in the world. There's a tendency for productive forces to grow. There's a tendency for capitalisms to compete against each other. Capitals will compete, bringing more and more technology in the workplace, pressuring workers more and more. That increases the total social wealth in the planet. But that social wealth, those gains of productivity, are taken by the capitalists as profit, which they see as their right. Profit is seen by capital as its right because of the idea of private property. It is my property that comes into the world, that hires labor, that hires the working class. The working class produces for me. It is my right. It is my right to extract as much of the profit as possible for my benefit. And it's that great struggle between the desire of people to live in a dignified world, to be free, to have sovereignty, to have liberty, all those words that capture that feeling. It's the great struggle between people's desire to live in a world of dignity and capital's right to extract profit from the great and increasing pie of social wealth. It is that conflict that Marx identifies as at the heart of the capitalist system. That conflict Marx calls the class struggle. And in that class struggle, the people who desire a dignified life create trade unions. You see, trade unions are a result of a class struggle imposed on the people by the system of private property. It is the owners of private property that initiate the class struggle. They are the ones who put increasing pressure on the people, prevent the people from living dignified lives where their children are not lying sick at home when they have to go to work to bring in wealth to survive. That sense of an undignified life is the experience that people have of the class struggle imposed by capital, by private property, which sees its right to be the extraction of as much social wealth as possible, which is called profit. Unions join in this class struggle, trying to fight on behalf of the people to put forward their great dream of a dignified world. And that is the reason why unions are not only essential in the modern world, in the capitalist world. Not only are unions essential, but unions are what keep people alive. You see, the idea of neoliberalism, which is part of your discussions, the idea of neoliberalism, which in India is known as liberalization. You see, in 1991, when the Congress government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister, when P.V. Narasimha Rao was the prime minister, when the Indian government decided to go to the International Monetary Fund in July 1991, they inaugurated a process called liberalization, which in fact is the Indian word for neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is not some fancy idea. It's a pretty straightforward idea that comes from a meeting of right-wing political forces in Switzerland, in a town called Mont Pelerin, 1948. In Mont Pelerin, these philosophers, politicians, economists gathered in 1948, right after the Second World War. And they decided that they had to defend the argument for free markets. In other words, they had to defend the idea that private property has a right. And the right of private property is to extract as much profit as possible. And in order for private property to be able to extract as much profit as possible, private property must define the rules of the economy. So when they talk about the free market, they don't actually mean there's a free market which is anarchic, undefined by anybody. They don't mean that at all. What they mean is that the rules of the marketplace must be defined by private property, which has a right, they say, to extract as much profit from the social wealth produced by labor. You saw this recently with the 3 farm bills put forward by Mr. Narendra Modi's government in the previous Lok Sabha building in New Delhi. That set of 3 bills, farm bills, essentially made the argument that the rules for the marketplace, the mandi, had to be set by private capital. Because in the logic of Mr. Modi's government, private capital has a right, maybe the only right in the economy, because it has a right to extract as much profit from social wealth. That was a good example of how capital was given permission to describe and define the rules of the marketplace. In 1948, these men at Montpellier in Switzerland gathered together to found the school of neoliberalism, where they argued that free markets must be without control, must be given the right to operate by themselves. But what they really meant was that private capital must have the right to define and describe the rules of the marketplace, whether this be in monetary policy, how a government decides how much money there should be in the economy, whether it should be in fiscal policy, how a government decides how they should spend their money through budgeting, whether it be in the rules of the workplace, how workplaces should be organized and defined, what should be the working conditions, what should be the pay range, and so on. Recently in India, again, a number of states have made the argument that the working day should be increased to 12 hours. Now, it was thanks to the struggles of trade unions and the communist movement in Tamil Nadu that the government of Chief Minister Stalin had to withdraw the bill to increase the working day to 12 hours. But other states have already increased the working day to 12 hours. Those of you who have read Karl Marx's Das Kapital know that Marx has a chapter in Kapital on the working day. Marx argues that capital, which believes it has the right to extract as much surplus value from workers, it has the right to take profit from the quantum, the sum total of social wealth. Capital wants to increase the working day. Marx calls that the increase of surplus value by the taking of absolute surplus value, by increasing the working day. Neoliberalism is merely the philosophy that allows private capital to set the rules of the marketplace, how the economy should function. It's nothing new. It's merely the philosophy of capitalism, the philosophy of the capitalist class. It is their viewpoint of how the world should be organized. In other words, the world for them should be organized such that they get to describe and define the economic and political system in the world. And that system, which they get to describe and define, is organized in such a way that as much of the social wealth produced by workers as possible must come into their hands. And that's what they consider their right to extract as much profit as possible. Neoliberalism is the philosophy of maximum extraction of profit by capital and the taking by capital, by force if necessary. In a country like Chile 50 years ago, there was a coup d'etat conducted by General Augusto Pinochet on behalf of the US government. The person in charge of that coup d'etat was Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who celebrated his 100th birthday 2 days ago. Mr. Kissinger and his president, US President Richard Nixon, put forward a philosophy. They said if the government of Chile wants to nationalize the copper, if they want to create a dignified life for the people of this country, then what's going to happen is the United States government is going to make the economy scream. Their policy was make the economy scream. If the people stand up, the people must be punished. And in 1973, there was a coup d'etat. And after the coup d'etat, the country became a laboratory for neoliberalism. Create rules that give private capital as much control over the social surplus. You know, when that coup took place on the 11th of September 1973, 10 days later in New Delhi, EMS Namboodiripad, General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, gave a seminar in New Delhi 10 days after the coup. That seminar was called Chile and the Parliamentary Road to Socialism, where EMS Namboodiripad, one of the most brilliant Indians to have ever lived, gave a lecture about the limitations of the experiment conducted by the Popular Unity government led by the Socialist Party of Chile and its president Salvador Allende. Now, EMS Namboodiripad talked about how this experiment in Chile had not mobilized the people to defend their government. The people were not mobilized. They were not prepared. And you see, Comrade EMS Namboodiripad, in his seminar, spoke from personal experience. Because after all, EMS Namboodiripad led the first communist government to be elected in India, if not in the world, in 1957. Comrade Namboodiripad governed from 1957 to 1959. But he had had a direct experience of when his government tried to go on the side of the people, tried to build the infrastructure for dignity for the people, turning some of the social surplus through taxation towards healthcare, education, building the capacity of people to govern their own lives, to build cooperatives, for instance. Such an important part of the world of Kerala. When EMS Namboodiripad government went in that direction, fighting against capital's right, the right of capital to extract as much surplus value, the communist government in Kerala said, no, if capital believes it has the right to as much social wealth as possible in the name of profit, then the government of the people will fight against capital to take some of that social wealth through taxation and produce a world of dignity. In Capital, Marx writes, when two equal rights clash, force decides. When two equal rights clash, force decides. In Kerala, in the 1950s, two equal rights clashed. Now, it's strange to call these equal rights, but in the eyes of the capitalists, they see their right to extract as much profit as possible as their right. They see that as a right, as their right. And the communist government in Kerala put forward a different right. They said it is the right of the people to live with dignity. That right of the people to live with dignity goes by all those names: liberty, sovereignty, equality, freedom, and so on. Different languages have different words, but they all refer to the same thing. When two rights collide, Marx writes, force decides. Either the force of the people organized into trade unions, the people organized into peasant organizations, the people organized into women's organizations, the people organized into anti-caste organizations, people organized into various groupings, student, youth, and so on. Either the people organized, and in the case of Kerala in the 1950s, organized behind a government, ready to defend the government. That's one right, the other right being the right of capital. And EMS Namboodiripad in September 1973 reflects back on the experience in Kerala 1959 and Chile 1973, and he suggests that the communist government had not done enough, either in the experiment in Chile or in Kerala, to mobilize the people to defend their government, to stand with their government when their government was attacked by capital. And indeed, that's what happened in 1959 in Kerala. And many people, including my friend Thomas Isaac, who I know addressed the Diamond Jubilee yesterday. Thomas Isaac has written a book which will be published soon, making the case that the overthrow of the communist government in Kerala in 1959 was in fact a coup d'etat against that government, with the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency and the central government of Jawaharlal Nehru. It was a coup d'etat, much like the coup d'etat against the Salvador Allende Popular Unity government in Chile. Now again, the example of these coups, whether in Kerala or in Chile, is merely a way to express to you that there is a sense that capital has, that it has a right to extract as much surplus value as possible. It has given that right a fancy philosophy called neoliberalism. And to establish that right in the world, capital will go to any length. It will crush trade unions. It will attack peasants. It will kill trade union organizers. And it will conduct coup d'etats against friendly governments. When it comes to the right of capital, all other rights are seen as subordinate. The propriety of respecting a democratic verdict, for instance, government has been elected by the people, let the government serve its term. The propriety of basic democratic rights is irrelevant to capital. The basic right of people to organize themselves into trade union formations in order to fight for their rights in the workplace, that basic right is not seen by capital as important as its right to extract as much surplus value, profit from the social wealth produced by workers. Capital sees its right to dominate the surplus. It sees its right as paramount, as singular, as the first right, and all other rights come afterwards. And you've seen increasing evidence of this in the world over the last period. Increasing evidence. Capital doesn't have a social conscience. It doesn't have social responsibility. It is not interested in what society requires or needs. It is even willing to destroy the planet or to take the world into a destructive war. It is willing to destroy the planet. It is willing to destroy humanity in order to establish its right to extract maximum surplus value. In fact, comrades and friends, the war that the United States is attempting to start with China is very much part of this. US tech companies, high-tech firms, feel threatened that Chinese companies are now developing technology that's as good, if not better, than what is produced by Apple and so on. And even if they are not as good, if the Chinese goods are not as good, they are much cheaper than what is sold by US and European companies. Europe and the United States are demanding that China stop its development agenda, that it backtrack on its development. It go back to being merely a producer of goods for US companies, for German companies, and so on, not for Chinese companies themselves. And in order to stop China from developing, the United States is leading a coalition with the Europeans and the Japanese to go to war against China. They are willing to lead the world into a destructive war in order to maintain their right to maximum profit. They're not listening to the cries of people who live in small islands, who say our land is being taken away by rising sea waters. They have rejected their own treaty obligations that they made in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992 at the Environment Summit. They promised to slow down on their own use of destructive carbon. And they said that they accept the principle of combined and differentiated responsibilities, which means the whole world is suffering from a climate environment catastrophe, but the responsibility for that catastrophe is not equal, and that the West will put in more effort to overcome its larger use of the carbon budget than the rest of the planet. They have rejected that. In fact, despite their attempt to say that they are more high and mighty than the rest of the world, as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, the German government is not going to close down their nuclear power plants. And in fact, the German government most likely might start up coal-fired power plants because they can't get natural gas from Russia. This capitalist class, the international capitalist class, is willing to take the world into environmental catastrophic destruction, willing to take the world into war, a world war with consequences we can't foretell. They are willing to do that because it's far more important for them to establish the principle of neoliberalism. It's far more important for them to take as much of the social surplus as profit rather than allow for the people around the world to build dignified lives. They are willing to take us to war or to destroy the planet in order to make their own world a reality for themselves, how they see the world. We have to resist this. We have to struggle against this. 60 years of your trade union and other unions, which are also here, struggling and fighting to establish that cry of the people for dignity, for sovereignty, for freedom, for equality. You stand with the people against the right of capital to private profit. You stand with the people. You are establishing the rights of the people to dignity. But more than anything else, in this context now, you're not only fighting for the people, but you're fighting to save the planet from catastrophic climate destruction. And you're fighting to prevent a catastrophic war. What is the point of getting an increase in wages if the planet is going to be destroyed? Our politics has to be much greater than the bargaining politics that out of which trade unions emerge. You are sentinels of the people. You stand for the people, with the people. You accompany the people to establish those great desires which people have had for hundreds of years. Those desires now are under grave threat from war and climate destruction. Those desires have been for a long time under grave threat from the neoliberal philosophy that says capital must get whatever it wants and labor must labor for capital, not for itself. Comrades and friends, this is the hour of joining together with all forces, all progressive and sensitive forces, to fight to build the rights of the people in the world. We don't have a choice now. We can't sit back and watch what's happening, be spectators to world history. We have to act. We must protect the planet. We must protect humanity. We don't have a choice. And in order to do that, we have to combine our forces. We have to let our old differences go by. We have to come together, bring the people together, unite the people, as it were, against the viciousness of capital and its. This is the hour of unity. This is the hour of dignity. Thanks a lot.